Asked me how I liked it. I said, it's astonishing. It's a fabulous dish. And I said, what do you think of it? He says, I don't know. I've never tasted it. And I said, what? And he said, well, you don't have to stick your hand in fire to know it's hot.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Decoding Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Chris LeBeau. At the ripe age of 38, I left my former career behind and joined the hospitality industry. Since then, I've been on a rapid journey of learning, meeting all sorts of great people, and this podcast is my chance to bring you along with me, whether I'm interviewing somebody that works in the industry, another enthusiast, or occasionally stepping back to share what I'm working on or my thoughts. I'm so glad you're here, and so with that aside, let's get into today's episode. What's happening, friends? Welcome back for another episode of Decoding Cocktails. I am Chris LeBeau, and today I am very excited, but also feel very grateful that I can bring to you this conversation I had with chef and author Michael Ruhlman. Michael is the author of 9 nonfiction books, 8 cookbooks of his own, and another thing that I think is important is he is the co-author of 10 other cookbooks, and he has been tapped for this by people like Chef Jean-Georges, Eric Ripert, and multiple times he's developed a great relationship with Chef Thomas Keller of the French Laundry. And these are chefs who are just at a level where they're going to have access to whoever they want. And the fact that they have chosen Michael to help them tell their story speaks to his ability to really get to the essence of something. He was also a good friend and several times on the TV shows with Anthony Bourdain, and so a late great muse for many of us. But what brought Michael and I together is not too long into lockdown, if my memory serves me correctly. As I was digging more into the cocktail thing, there are so many analogies at times between cocktails and the culinary world. And I was very fascinated by several of the things Michael was talking about. He was talking about, he has a book called 20, which explores technique, the 20 techniques you should know, as well as his book Ratio, which explores things like breads and pastas, how really at the end of the day, if you want to make your own, they are a game of ratios. And I happened to see as I was reading these that Michael was doing a lot of experimentation with cocktails. And so I was like, oh my gosh, I started threading the needle for myself, and I was like, hey, are there books you highly recommend that people should get? And Michael, delicately or not, was like, well, there are some good ones out there, but there's not one I heartily recommend, and that's why I'm writing one. So here we are today to talk about the book of cocktail ratios, The Surprising Simplicity of Classic Cocktails. So in this book, Michael lays out 7 of his own families for cocktails. And not only do I think he does a great job of breaking them down, but importantly, and this is a distinction that is only held by a few books in my opinion, is most of these, the books you can buy, are written by a bartender, let's say, and it's really written for other bartenders. And I mean that in the sense that so often the builds are extremely complex. The processes are very labor-intensive in some of the recipes, and that is not what this book is about. This book is about, for you, the home bartender, and designed to not have you constantly running to the liquor store. It wants you to understand the importance of technique and these ratios, but it's not going to call on you to make things that are so fringe that you're going to end up with lots of bottles that you're never going to end up using. In fact, Michael outlines just a couple of things beyond basic spirits he thinks you should have on hand. It was also fun to have Michael, because egg whites or eggs can play such a prominent role. Michael has written an entire book on the egg, and so we got into that a little bit. Talks quite a bit about batching for when you're hosting or when you want to take drinks on the road with you to a friend's house. Another thing I'm going to be interested to experiment with, so if you're not new here, you've heard me harp on vermouth too many times, and vermouth, as we've discussed too many times, is not shelf stable once you open it. But Michael says that for his wife's birthday, he made a large batch of Negronis, and when they weren't all used, he put them in the refrigerator and found that for the next couple of months, he was able to continue enjoying those. And while some people out there might balk at this, or kind of some mixologists might say that just won't work. I have to imagine Michael has a pretty refined palate. That doesn't mean his word is law, but that's interesting for me to think about. Okay, like, what does that mean when we end up fortifying the vermouth in terms of that being able to hang on a little longer? So that's pretty cool. So anyways, I think the book would be very worth your time. There'll, of course, be a link to it. You can find Michael at Ruhlman, RUHLMAN.com, and that is also his Instagram handle. Michael was honestly a joy to chat with. We had a lot of fun. And so anyways, I think you'll enjoy this conversation with him. You just asked me about, kind of my initial cocktail moment. In the book, you talk about, hey, first sip of your martini at age 8, and obviously your reaction, like many of us, was obviously like not love at first taste. You are now, obviously, as you say, and are not shy about, like, you love martinis now. Is there a cocktail you remember, or a cocktail experience when you were an adult, a teen? Is there a moment you remember beginning to feel captivated by cocktails yourself?
I only realized this while you were talking about yours, and I'd never really acknowledged it before. Yes, I'd had that sip of my father's martini at age 8 on our way to pick up the babysitter. So he was driving in our 1972 Mustang. And it was revolting. And we no longer, of course, drink in the car, as was common in my dad's. He was an ad man who looked very much like John Hamm, actually. There was a moment when I would always taste. I love tasting. I love to cook, and I write about cooking and food and drink. I would always taste stuff, and he had an after dinner drink, a little tiny cordial glass of Drambuie, and I tasted a little. He said, "Would you like a sip?" I said, "Sure." I think it was probably 6 or 7, and the way this liqueur, this brandy-based liqueur, bloomed on my tongue and spread out through my mouth, I was astonished. I was absolutely astonished. I thought this was amazing. Wow, what flavor! What it did in your mouth was extraordinary. It was like an explosion in my mouth, a happy explosion. And so I always, so from that year on, I was allowed to have a thimbleful of Drambuie, and I would probably sip it for an hour, because I'd have to taste and then let the flavor go away, so it would have that same impact, that bloom in your mouth. And that's when I realized, I guess, the power of spirits. And being from a very waspy family, a very big drinking family, my grandma Rose looked at me and said, my dad's mother, and said, "You're going to be a Scotch drinker." And she said it with pride. I thought, "Oh, okay, I'm going to be a Scotch drinker." I'm not a Scotch drinker. I'm sorry to say, Grandma Rose. But there was that. So those two moments. One, the sort of absolutely appalled taste of this medicinal, nasty martini out of a plastic cup from a cup holder in the console of the car, and the thimbleful of Drambuie on Christmas. Then I would fast forward to my 30s or 40s, when I was visiting my mom in West Palm Beach, where she'd been living for many years. My parents divorced amicably, and I was looking. I thought, how would I want a rum drink. So I don't know how I looked for it, but I found a Hemingway rum drink, and then I looked at daiquiris, and I thought, oh, daiquiris aren't slushy. They're It's simple syrup and lime juice and rum. And so I made one. I made some simple syrup. I microwaved some water with sugar in the microwave, um, and when it was cool, I made a drink with fresh lime juice and rum, and it was fabulous. I thought, oh my God, so this is what a daiquiri is. And if this is what a daiquiri is, what are all those other drinks? And that was a moment. I can't remember when it was, but it must have been in the 90s, like right about when I started writing about food and cooking. So I was curious about that kind of thing. And I'd been interested in ratios and how things came together and recipes and what mattered and what didn't. But I was kind of astonished that here's this age old drink and I didn't really know what it was. And then I thought, what more don't I know?
I love that it was the daiquiri too, because in many of the classes I teach, I often lead with the daiquiri because for a lot of people, still the uninitiated out there are those people they've had an old fashioned or whatever. Most people, like, they still think, red drink when they hear daiquiri. And there's that moment to watch great rum, fresh lime, that little sweetness hit people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just, it's pleasurable for me to see them often take it in a great way and to ask like, oh, like, because I feel like rum is that category that still has not really had the same whiskey, tequila, moment of like gin moment of people looking at it and be like, oh, this is a dignified category. Okay, got it. So
Mm-hmm.
to the go ahead.
Well, since we're talking about daiquiri, I have to ask you, are you a traditional daiquiri drinker using a lime cordial? Well, I guess I'm thinking about the gimlet. No, daiquiri is just lime and simple syrup. But since I am curious, do you go for and I'm looking at lime sours basically.
Yep.
Do you go for a lime cordial in your gimlet, or do you like a fresh lime gimlet?
So to the Decoding Cocktails content feed coming up very soon, I'm actually getting ready to produce a lime cordial video. So the answer is, because I often have citrus laying around, I will often squeeze a la minute if I'm just making a cocktail at home. But at times when my citrus is going bad on me, I will turn around and create a cordial. And so I feel like my go-to reach is a fresh lime juice gimlet if I was going to have one. But would I very much welcome the lime cordial? Absolutely. And I think that Jeffrey Morgenthaler's recipe that you have in the book is very much, his process is what I follow for it.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so
a good one.
Yep, it is. It is. So I know you also wrote in the book that so one, you obviously, long culinary history. You said that during, I forget if it was during the pandemic itself or not, that you had noticed a copy infringing audiobook online, and you pinged your editor about it, like, hey, like, let's take this down. And your editor said to you, hey, are you working on anything? And you talked about this ratio book. So is there a moment you remember the ratios of cocktails beginning to hit you? Was it a slow trickle? Because obviously you've thought about ratios very intensively since writing your book, but is there a moment when that first occurred to you that you can recall? Or how did the book process begin to build for you?
It happened because of the Friday Cocktail Hour Instagrams and videos that we would do, where I'd make a new cocktail every week. And because I was making, a cocktail every week, a different cocktail every week, I was saying, God, these are so similar. This is just the cocktail we did a couple of weeks ago, only swapping out, whiskey for the gin. And so there was that, the recognizing the interconnectedness of all the cocktails. There was, of course, my just innate desire to pare down and simplify recipes to their essence, which is what the original book ratio was. And then there were all the people commenters on the Instagram saying, when's the book coming out? And my wife saying, you got to write a book about this. And I thought, well, what is that book? It's not just the Friday Cocktail Hour with lots of recipes. What is that book? And then I thought about, well, they're all related, and so many people don't know that. And so let's explore this in a book. And cocktails, unlike bread, unlike pancakes, um, which takes some sort of finesse and some sort of technique, cocktails are all about the ratio. Cocktails are ratios, period. They are pure ratios. And so I thought, here's the book. So I wrote the proposal, sent it to my editor at Abrams, and he passed on it. He didn't like it, didn't think it was, he talked to colleagues, didn't like it, talked to some other editors that I'd worked with before, and nobody wanted it. Frankly, it's hard to be an older white guy in publishing these days. I've got an agent friend, and she called me and says, I actually sold a book by a white guy, an older
Sure.
white guy. And so I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't discouraged. And it was then that I chanced upon this pirated version of the Audible ratio, and I contacted Scribner, and I got some woman in the rights department, and she said, well, let's take it down. And she got it taken down. And then I said, well, gosh, if somebody thinks they can make money off it, maybe we should do an Audible version of ratio. And she said, that would be great. Do you have anything to tie into it? And I said, in fact, I do have something, and it's actually a cocktail book based on ratios. Would you have a look? I'd love to send it to Scribner, but I'm not sure who I should send it to because I haven't worked with Scribner in more than 10 years. And she said, well, I'm the executive editor. You should send it to me. And I felt so embarrassed because I hadn't even Googled her. I thought she was just in the rights department. And
Sure.
And she took the proposal, and I didn't have an agent at the time. I was between agents. So I sold that book to Scribner on my own. And it's been at the same time, I got an email from a PR firm in LA saying, would you like to see some watercolors by this illustrator that we're now representing? I said, sure, why not? And what they sent was a kitchen towel with a cornucopia of fruits and vegetables on it, and a 9x12 watercolor picture of an old fashioned, a cocktail.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh my God, this is beautiful. I love this. And I immediately wrote to Kara and said, would you be interested instead of photographs for this book, and they're dull after a while.
Yep.
Would you be interested in an all watercolor and illustrated cocktail book? Could we do this all illustrated, no photography? And she said, I love the idea. And so that's how this whole book came about.
So one, I love the way the book is laid out, but I have to say that even when, for a lot of cocktail photos, even when they try to not look overly sexed up, it just feels so, I don't want a cocktail handed to me that looks like droopy and lazy, but at the same time, I feel like for people if this book is for people at home, so many of these photographs are just like, I dare you to make it look anything like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so with the illustrations, I feel like that gives you a little bit of like, it's elegant, but also, it's abstract at the same time too.
That's a really good point. I hadn't thought consciously about it, but I think you're exactly right. The photography in most cocktail books is every drink is like on the red carpet. It's like they're dressed up to the nines and they are getting their photo taken on the red carpet before the Oscars. And that does it's what's bothered me about a lot of food photography, especially in magazines, is that it's so beautiful, it makes people feel like failures when theirs isn't beautiful. So that is another good benefit of having illustrated cocktails.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things I would love to dive into, and we can get at the book as other ways, but believe it or not, this is the first time I've had someone on the show who's written a whole book about eggs. And I love that you take license to say, because I say this when I'm teaching all the time too, like, listen, I don't care if this daiquiri doesn't call for an egg white. You can put it in there and try it if you want. And so when you have a sour or these daisy style drinks, why not give it a try? So, what is it about the egg itself, knowing so much about it? What is it that makes the egg white or the egg such a great complement to the cocktail? Why does it do so well in there in the first place?
Well, because you can have one in the afternoon and call it a protein shake. Um, what an egg white does in a cocktail is it adds visual appeal in the form of froth, um, and it adds, most importantly, body. Most of our cocktails are thin, even if they're a margarita or a cocktail with a liqueur in it or something heavy. It gives it um, that awful term, which we can never find a replacement for, mouth feel. Um, it feels better on the palate. It spreads it out more. And there is some nutrition in it. Egg whites are protein. And they just add so much. And in fact, God, you're saying this now makes me want to go make a margarita with an egg white to see if I'm right. I mean, I just posited the idea in the book, but I've never actually made a margarita with an egg white because you just don't do that. But why not?
I can't remember if it's an article from the Wondrich era at Esquire or just after David left to someone you know very well from this book. But they have in one of their like winter cocktail list rundowns, they have a mezcal marg that they have egg white in.
Oh, really?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Oh, how about
So,
that?
so if
So
you
I guess
would
it works.
yeah, so if you type in like wintry cocktails Esquire, it will pop up as their recipe. I don't remember if it's David's or not, but it then was probably whoever the drinks editor was following David.
I will do that. I prefer a mezcal margarita.
Hmm. Uh, Something that I haven't really done as much that I like that you called out. Obviously, since this book was born, so much of the Friday cocktail hour, and even if you were doing it on Instagram, it was often people were coming over not too long after that at some point to batch them. When we are making an egg white cocktail, whiskey sour, for easy example, and
Mhm.
we're dropping an immersion blender in there or whatnot, is there, egg, obviously you can pull it out of the fridge. It's not going to be bad in 5 minutes. But do you have any thoughts on like once you're batching a whiskey sour, you know, you could always do it 20 minutes before people come over. But if you were preparing for guests to come over and you were going to batch a whiskey sour with an immersion blender, so you'd in your Pyrex, I think as you say, your large scale Pyrex, you'd add your whiskey, your lemon, your simple syrup, your egg white, hit it with the immersion blender, and then drop ice in there. Like, is there anything people should think about regarding batching a cocktail like this in terms of timing?
Well, with eggs, eggs are a little funny. They'll change over time with the reacting to the spirit. And so it's a kind of a cocktail I wouldn't batch and preserve the
Right.
way you could a Negroni. You can
Right.
you can batch Negronis and keep them in the fridge forever.
Sure.
But the egg is going to change over time. It's eventually going to go bad. It'll separate. But I batch, but for one evening, I mean, how and a whiskey sour is one that I often batch when we're having 2 to 6 people, 2 to 4 people over for cocktails, because they're so appreciative. I mean, they're really appreciative of it. I mean, I had one guy, an editor from Vanity Fair, came over and said, "God, could I have another one?" And he said, "I never drink 3 cocktails," but they were so good and so surprising. So I like to do that for guests. Batching them ahead of time is fine. The egg will not cook or separate, and you just give it another buzz of the hand blender, and it will be good all night.
Okay.
I even took a batch to a friend's house for dinner, and I put them in a ball jar. I mixed them, chilled them, put it in a ball jar, and just shook it before I poured them at the house, so they traveled okay. But for the most part, you want to batch. Co- Sorry about that. For the most part, you want to batch cocktails that have just alcohols in them, not simple syrups, not liqueurs, not stuff of different viscosities.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I loved you talked about and I was curious because you talked about for Anne's birthday and before I forget, yeah. So I think like for an egg white cocktail, yeah, I was thinking more like people are coming over for dinner tonight, not like for the days and weeks ahead. But that's good to know in terms of not necessarily worrying about them keeping all night. Um, because yeah, like, I was curious, knowing that vermouth, we're fortifying it when we put it in a cocktail,
Mhm.
but it does still have a shelf life. So, because you said that, like, I think in the book that that batch Negroni kept for months, in your opinion, and didn't really turn in a way you found noticeable.
4 months I was still serving it and it was fine.
Okay.
You know, alcohol is a great preservative. That's why you can make, eggnog and keep it on your pantry shelf for 2 or 3 years. And it grows more funky and interesting, but it's killed all the bacteria. It's pasteurized.
Got it. Okay. So, to that point, I batch eggnog now during the holidays. Are you saying it's actually shelf stable outside of the refrigerator? I always keep it in the refrigerator.
It is shelf stable outside the refrigerator. And according to, God, I think it was, I think Kenji, Kenji.
Uh huh.
I hope everybody knows Kenji. He's such a wonderful person and such an asset to the culinary world. Um, he it's either him or somebody else did an experiment and found that after 30 days, all bacteria had been killed. They did an experiment with this. And so, yeah, I a month before you're going to serve the eggnog. So at Thanksgiving time, we'll often make our eggnog, and we usually save a ball jar full of it, keep it on the pantry shelf at room temperature. And I've been able to keep one as much as 3 years. Uh, so it's 3 years with cream and sugar and booze and seasonings. It works. It works, and it's healthy and safe. But I don't think 3-year-old eggnog tastes as good as fresher eggnog.
Sure.
It gets funky. It depends on your taste, but it's fun to do.
I will say, as an aside, I feel like, and there are so many cocktails, and like to the editor, the Vanity Fair editor, it's like, I feel like a lot of some people don't identify as being cocktail people because they haven't been served. And clearly there are good cocktails in many places now. But like, yeah, like when you get good cocktails, people are suddenly just like, geez, but yeah, eggnog is another thing that I love showing people for the first time. Cause like they've often sometimes had like that grocery store, whatever the heck, not,
They usually only have that.
yeah.
Yeah.
And they have good eggnog and they're like, what is this? It's so good. So
So
good.
good. It's not this viscous, syrupy stuff that comes out of a carton.
So we talked about the cocktail codex, and so when I see your book a little bit,
Mhm.
I now the cocktail codex is much more complex. I like to say, like, I feel like uh, Alex and David and that crew, while someone like me can own it, that's really written for a bartender. But they do identify these families in the codex.
Mhm.
One of the things I was curious about is because I know that you certainly like your martini a little stronger than I do, but I was curious in the codex, they kind of really loop in the Manhattan and the martini together. You view them as separate drinks. Talk to me about, is that just the ratio balance to you, Michael, or tell me why you think about, and they don't have to be. I'm more curious why you separated them.
Um, yeah, I disagree with the way they've organized their families. It's a terrific book, Cocktail Codex, by the Death and Company folks, where they identify families. And yeah, the martini is in the same family as the Manhattan for them because it's a spirit and vermouth drink. Um, my book differs in that I want to make simplify it. This is really a book for the home cocktail enthusiast.
Yep.
I want to simplify it for them, and a Manhattan is not anywhere near a martini. Flavor wise, flavor wise, that's all we're talking about. I mean, they're both boozy. They're both, have similarities. They both use vermouth. But I was looking at the Manhattan, which is a spirit and sweet vermouth, and that's a style of drink. Whether it's a Palmetto, which is a Manhattan made with rum, or a tequila Manhattan or a Rob Roy. They're all the same. Basically, what I wanted to create was a template for drinks in which you would swap out the spirit and it was called something else and it was a whole different drink. Codex does it in a little bit more esoteric way. They have specific brands and types of alcohols. It is for the professional bartender. In fact, I've never made a cocktail from Cocktail Codex or Death and Company. Now I kind of have to now. Now I'm going to branch out a little and move away from the classics and see what's going on, because I did have some great new cocktails in my sort of journey through this. So I have the last word in the book, which is a pre-prohibition era cocktail, and it was resuscitated by a Seattle bartender, and put on the menu in the 2000 aughts, I imagine, in Seattle, and it was so good it took off, and it's now a standard classic cocktail. But the 1:1:1 ratio of gin, lime juice, chartreuse, and Luxardo is solid, so that Phil Ward in New York, when he was opening his tequila bar, this was probably when he was at Death and Company. Phil Ward's one of the great bartenders and a quirky motherfucker, whom I like very much. He swapped out the gin and put in overproof rye. And his boss at the time, Audrey Saunders of the Pegu Club, that's probably where it was, called it not the last word, but because his name was Phil Ward, W-A-R-D, the final ward.
Yep.
And it's a terrific cocktail. And then when he was opening his tequila bar, he used the 1:1:1 ratio to create the Division Bell, which is tequila and Aperol and an Amaro and lime juice.
Yeah, I think it's tequila, Aperol, Maraschino, and ours. Yeah, it doesn't matter either way. Yeah, but the Division Bell is great. I've definitely made it before. You've got it here in the book for sure. But I would agree with what I like about talking to people about the Martini and the Manhattan through the Death and Co. lens is seeing them as spirit and vermouth, and like they are similar in that they call in the same style of ingredients. But I would agree that they do not present as similar drinks at all in terms of taste and body. To your point, the Distrito Federal, the Palmetto, the Manhattan, even the Boulevardier in a way, is kind of like they're at least presenting in a slightly more similar form.
Right.
But yeah, the versus the Martini is just going to be such a departure. So
Right. So they don't belong in the same families. They're a different drink, and they're so much more fascinating that way. And you are right. I quickly checked. The Division Bell is tequila, Aperol. That's the Amaro flavor, and Luxardo and lime juice. And
yeah,
it's a great drink.
it is a great drink.
And follow that, and swap all those out for other spirits, and you have a paper plane. With a very special type of Amaro. I'm fascinated by 4-ingredient 1:1:1 drinks.
Yeah.
They're complex and interesting and delicious.
It's interesting where I think that the last word has more cachet, but the number of people that aren't super serious cocktail people that know the paper plane blows my mind sometimes. It's amazing how often, in terms of, to Robert's whole world of the modern classic, paper plane is just, it feels like a giant out there. It feels like it's everywhere. So
that's what makes it a classic cocktail.
Yeah.
In fact, there's another Phil Ward story. I think I write about this in the book, but I interviewed him for the book. He was in Italy with a pal a year ago, and they were looking for a bar. And he says, there are no bars in Italy. It's always a cafe. I just want to sit at a bar. I like bars. When I'm on vacation, I miss bartending. I miss bartending when I'm away. I like bars. And so they last found one, and they sat down and they both ordered a martini, And the guy next to him, an Italian cocktail nerd, ordered a Division Bell. And the guys, then Phil's friend said, "Oh my God, he just ordered your drink. I got to tell him." And Phil said, "No, don't do that. Stop. Be quiet." But that's when you know you've got a classic on your hand.
No doubt. Yeah. And I've not met Phil before. I hear he's a total character. And yet I remember an interview with a couple of the Death and Co staff, and they're like, I think Phil just came out of the womb a fully formed bartender. They're just like his prowess is just uncanny, is what. And
Yeah.
he's in a number of drinks, obviously referenced to. Something else was interesting. Obviously, the Manhattan versus a Boulevardier. So for the people out there that don't know those terms as readily, so we're talking about a whiskey, either a rye and a bourbon. Most of the time, bourbon and vermouth in a Boulevardier versus rye and vermouth in a Manhattan. But you talked about when we're making the jump to Boulevardier, we're adding Campari in there. You said in a Boulevardier, I feel like the whiskey you call is probably more important than in a Manhattan. And
Mm-hmm.
I was curious if you'd expand on that a little bit. Not that I'm more curious, like, what is it that makes it more important in one than the other? They're not the same drink, but I'm more curious why you feel that it matters more.
Um, I think we'd have to go to a food scientist like Harold McGee or something like that to
Fair enough.
know why this is true. But it's only because I've read in more than one source that upping the quality of the whiskey in a Manhattan, which is 2 parts whiskey, 1 part sweet vermouth, upping the quality of that bourbon doesn't markedly change the drink. It's going to be just as good with a Michter's as it is with a Maker's. Um, whereas, and I think that's just because vermouth is a very powerful ingredient. It's what created actually it was what created cocktails in America was the vermouth. Um, but I don't know if that whole, maybe a Boulevardier, which is equal parts whiskey, sweet vermouth, and Campari. I'll bet because of the power, especially because of the powerful Campari in there, and the sweetness and herbaceousness of the vermouth, I'll bet that too does not require a better whiskey. On the other hand, if you're making an old fashioned, still one of the most popular cocktails out there, which is the sugar bitters, and whiskey, our America's foundational cocktail, arguably. Um, Quality of the bourbon is going to matter. Quality of the rye is going to matter.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And so I think I just think it was a fascinating point, and I need to look up who Harold McGee is for sure.
Well, you
But
do. You must
I will,
immediately.
I will right now. This interview's over. Uh, but yeah, I think to me that's the thing that's interesting for my own line of thinking, but to educate people, like, when does spirit quality matter versus, hey, when
Mhm.
can you, without buying garbage, when do
Right.
you not need to break the bank on something? And speaking of that, I did like that in the book, you certainly talked, that this book is for people that in theory don't have to, like, you go out and buy the codex. And if you skim it carefully, you can find a recipe where you're like, oh, like, all I need to do is buy a bottle of sherry. Okay, this doesn't get crazy. Versus,
Right.
oh, this is an 8 ingredient cocktail with a sous vide infusion. And you're like, okay, yeah, this is a little crazy. But I liked in the book that I feel like, called out for the most part maraschino liqueur.
Mhm.
You called out chartreuse because it is incredible. And then I think you also talked about absinthe a little bit. I like this idea that I tell people, outside of your spirits, I
Mhm.
think I love vermouth. I'm a diehard advocate for it. Uh, that a bottle of orange liqueur, and to your point from there, maybe one of these slightly more esoteric liqueurs. Like,
Mhm.
don't go totally crazy at home unless it's really your thing, because otherwise there's gonna end up being dust on all of them.
Yeah, you don't need the Benedictine, you don't need the elderflower liqueur, or you don't need the creme de violette. Um, but the maraschino liqueur, the most popular brand is Luxardo. Absinthe, which has been around forever and is now back, and Cointreau. Those are really the three. Um, maraschino, Cointreau, um,
We said
chartreuse.
chartreuse.
Chartreuse was the other one. Um, those are all really versatile. So if you are an enthusiast of cocktails, I do recommend splurging on those, but you don't need a ton of them. You definitely need an orange liqueur because that's fundamental in so many drinks. But when I made, God, is it Peter Meehan who created the Hemingway deck,
It was
the Sun
Jim.
Also Rises?
Yeah, Jim Meehan. Jim Meehan. So
Yeah.
is that his brother, Peter? Is that his brother?
Peter
Yeah.
is his, yeah,
Yeah.
is his
Okay.
brother.
Yeah.
Um, when I tasted that and realized that it was exactly a Hemingway daiquiri with a little bit of absinthe in it, and how different it was, and how
Yeah.
remarkable it was, I thought, oh my God, how fascinating. This is genius to just a little bit of this absinthe changes things. Um, and I confirmed it when I made a White Lady and added some maraschino liqueur to it, just like a teaspoon of it, and it absolutely transformed the drink. So I'm just fascinated by the power of these liqueurs. And that's part of cocktail history. That's how they often started. That's why we have the improved whiskey cocktail, which is
Mhm.
basically an old fashioned with some absinthe in it and
Mhm.
maybe some Luxardo.
You know, Michael, one of the things you said towards the beginning that I think about a lot is like, the number of people out there that own, while Cointreau might not be the number one thing you want to sit around and just sip on its own, that we need to, when we have these flavorful things in our cabinet, we should probably know what the raw ingredient itself tastes like, even though they're maybe not meant to be drunk neat.
Mhm.
With your culinary and tasting background, when you started messing around with kind of the idea of adding a little bit of maraschino or absinthe to something, were there any signposts of a spirit or a style of drink? Was there a way that for somebody out there who's trying to guess, and I always like to say, like, the average cocktail costs a couple of bucks really to make it home, so you can afford to mess it up. But
Mhm.
were there signposts that told you, oh, with this White Lady cocktail, I would rather add maraschino than absinthe? I guess I'm curious how you think about that. If you have any suggestions for people at all.
Um, my suggestion would be to recognize that we have taste memory and taste imagination, and that we can, if we're thoughtful, imagine how something tastes. Um, and we know that Luxardo is cherry flavored, well, Cointreau is um, orange flavored, and absinthe is almost medicinal in its flavor. Um, that's where your starting point is. And I remember this. I was working with Thomas Keller at the French Laundry on his book, and he has this fascinating dish. It's a signature dish. It's called oysters and pearls. It's this weird combination. It's tapioca, like vanilla tapioca pudding, on which there's a film of oyster liquid, on top of which he puts a raw oyster and a dollop of caviar. So you've got tapioca, you've got these childhood pleasures of tapioca, comforting pleasures of tapioca, and then you've got this very adult, sophisticated caviar flavor, this very refined taste that we develop a taste for, mediated by this weird sort of cartoonish oyster in between. And I just thought it was a fascinating dish. And I said, Thomas, he asked me how I liked it. I said, it's astonishing. It's a fabulous dish. And I said, what do you think of it? He says, I don't know. I've never tasted it. And I said, what? And he said, well, you don't have to stick your hand in fire to know it's hot. And that's when I started thinking about taste memory, taste imagination. And so we can develop this and we get better and better at it by imagining what something's going to taste like. And we do this when we're cooking all the time. Imagine what it's going to taste like and then taste it, and how does it match up to what was in your imagination? And then you learn from that.
Yeah, so what that triggers for me is one, my friend and mentor who is almost 10 years younger than me. When I remember showing him like specs early on for various drinks, and he'd look at him like, okay, yeah, I could see how that would work. This idea that he And I think part of that for people, again, at home is this idea of like, taste lemon juice often, like what does that taste like? How does that, tasting your simple syrup, like, so you can begin to think about what might these flavors be like when they mesh together. And so I like the answer that, like, I have felt my receptors starting to kick in a little bit when I want to doctor a drink, where it's like, okay, I've played in the sandbox enough now that now I think I begin to understand how some of these things are going to play together here. So that's
Yeah,
fair.
absolutely. It's just a matter of thinking and I mean and being curious and remembering, like, how does lemon juice differ from lime? What's the difference there? Why do we use lime and sometimes lemon?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I like lime in a whiskey sour rather than lemon. You suggest lemon. They're both whiskey sours.
Right.
Um, the more you taste, the more you taste, the more attuned you become to nuance and the nuances of flavor.
Yeah.
And you teach yourself, which is what you've been doing for years now, and what I've been doing, and what everybody who cares about food and drink and cooking and creating what we think about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are there drink muses or ingredients you have at the moment you've been playing with more? Like, and we don't have to be having cocktails all the time, but are there things that you've been messing around with at all recently?
Um, no, I haven't. It's been busy, so I haven't. A friend gave me a bottle of cardamom amaro, and
Okay.
that's been interesting. And you can swap out the sweet vermouth in a Manhattan, and you've got something closer to a Little Italy that from Audrey Saunders classic. Um, I will play with the Luxardo. Um, a friend left as a friend stayed at our apartment and left us a bottle of $70 chartreuse. So I've been doing some chartreuse cocktails. Um, so yes, I will definitely play. But for the most part, I'm a martini guy. At the end of the day, I'm going to mix a martini. It's going to be a 6-to-1 martini in a frozen glass. It's going to be a 3-ounce martini with a half ounce of vermouth, a dash of orange bitters, and a twist where I can actually see the oil hitting the surface of the martini. Um, I add a half ounce of water because I want it quick, and I keep the Beefeater gin in the freezer. And I know bartenders shake their head at this, but it's faster and easier, and it's colder. Frankly, I've made when I haven't had the gin in the freezer, I've made a stirred martini. It's not cold enough for me. I love that. A martini is a drink that has to be ice cold, absolutely ice cold, and then it's a great drink with the orange bitters, lemon oil, and the twist, and a decent vermouth at
Yep.
6-to-1. I really like.
Yeah.
And my
Uh,
wife will have Manhattan. Again, another simple drink, quickly made, 2-to-1, bourbon, vermouth, and chocolate bitters from Bittermans, which we love in a Manhattan. So, and ask any bartender, what do you have at home? They're going to say, I have a martini or Manhattan or a Negroni.
yep.
They have the simple drinks.
Yeah. No, I mean, I pretty much drink Negronis and daiquiris at home when as my kind of go-tos here. So, I hear that. Yeah, it's just every once in a while, like it's also like probably different stages of the game where like you have things you're kind of like temporarily messing around with or whatnot. I I've posted about this because I feel I like it a lot, but Lustau's got their vermouths on the market are real good, real good. Their Blanco vermouth is fantastic. I cannot recommend it enough. So
Which brand?
Lustau, they're the Spanish sherry company. So
Oh, Spain has some good stuff like that. Spain has good vermouths, good sherries.
yeah. Yeah. So Lustau's Blanco in particular, if you've got the right liquor store, obviously in New York, you've got everything. But so look up Lustau's Blanco is just fantastic.
How do you spell that? Lustaus?
Yeah. Lustau.
Just okay.
Yep.
Good. I will. Yeah, we have the remarkable Astor wines here, not far from my apartment. So I know they will have it.
You know, I obviously, can't recommend enough to people who are looking to kind of dig deeper into ratios to try the book, because I feel like it again will help you better. The key to cocktails, I think, is to be able to think about them well so that they don't feel like work. When it feels like this substitution, you understand, oh, we're to your point, the martini and the Manhattan, they are not alike. And so in terms of flavor, versus when we have kind of all these palmettos and Manhattans, we learn to think about what's a drink going to roughly be like when I have it. Are there other aha moments you feel like you had when writing the book or researching it that are top of mind you've wanted to talk about that I haven't asked about so far? Or is it,
Not that I can put my finger on, because I mean there are so many of them and they happen all the time. And the act of writing actually brings them about. The act of, I'll be writing something and I thought, hey, this is an idea. Let me go mix this up, and give it a taste. Um, but that's just all a process of writing a book. I write a book because I don't, not because I know something, because I don't know something. I write a book to explore an idea, and that's what makes writing fun and interesting and keeps me from being bored. And that's what I did with the book of cocktail ratios. Um, I wanted to explore. I wanted to see if I could gather if this really worked. Does this initial notion that because a Negroni is just a Boulevardier using gin rather than whiskey, how many other drinks are like that? So that
yeah,
was the impetus for the book. Um, and I'm sure there are smaller revelations along the way, that have just been absorbed into my being and are no longer surprising because I've recognized them and confirmed them. Um, that's something for me to think about. I don't know. If I think of something, I'll let you know.
that's all right. It was probably a big question, anyways. I am curious because you cited in the book so many times the Oxford Companion book from David Wondrich. I have a copy upstairs. You know, the research in undertaking a book is obviously pretty monstrous. Did you read that book cover to cover, or like every time someone gave it to me, and I have flipped through it a couple times, but it's just like every time I look at it, I just go, God, that's just it's intimidating.
No, you don't read a book like that cover to cover. That's a reference book. You go to it for specific reasons. When I wanted to know about the history of Negroni, that was the first place I went. Um, it's just he's just so damn good, David
Yep.
Wonder. He's so knowledgeable. He brings both academicians, and academics, um, research ethos and intelligence, along with you know kind of just a hippie smoker sticking his lucky strike in his guitar fret and continuing to jam and play. So he's just such an interesting character, and he's so smart, and he's so good at what he does. And this book came out right when I was writing this. It was just like a godsend as far as background on certain drinks. I could just look up. Okay, who was the guy who brought back the last word? What was his name? Stenson. Okay, here it is. Yeah. Mm.
No, you're right, and that is how I've used it so far, and so I figured that's it. It's just I remember I forget who it was who talked about. They were like, I think it was Robert Simonson. He was like, I heard about it, and then I didn't hear anything about it, and then I heard about it, and then I didn't hear anything about it, and at some point you just assume, I guess this isn't happening, and yeah,
Well, it's such a monumental work.
it's a tome.
It is a tome, and well worth it if you're in the business or curious about it, or just want to know about different rums, or you know what's in a Via Carré cocktail, that kind of thing. There's recipes, there's stories. It's an extraordinary accomplishment.
You probably say this in the book, but since I'm getting ready to go shoot a video on it, I might as well ask. So for a gimlet for you, are you partial to fresh juice or to cordial? I feel like I remember the answer, but I'm not sure. So what's your preference?
My preference is for a fresh lime juice, which is just be lime juice and simple syrup and gin. Um, I have made Robert Morgenthaler's cordial, which is outstanding. I gave it to my wife, and she said, "Ooh, it's too sharp. It was too sharp for her." So it's very sharp. But that's what that's what a lot of people want in a gimlet, which back when Rose's lime juice was the main half the ingredients in it, when that was still good, it was very sharp and very sweet. So that is traditionally what the drink would have been at its inception. But right now, I think a classic lime sour, it's a daiquiri made with gin rather than rum.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. I mainly, like I said, look at it as a preservation technique rather than having to throw a bunch of limes out. So I hear that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I save all my, because I have a martini most, not every night, but most nights after work if we're in. And so I'll have a lot of lemons with no peel on them. And so I will juice them and save them for when we make a sour. So
Yeah.
I do that. And I don't know why I said that, but because you made me think of preserving and whatnot. But I'm very frugal, which is why I don't want people to go out and buy $130 bottle of something that they're only going to use once. And I would urge them to save their lemon juice, which keeps for a long time, especially if there's sugar in it. Things like interesting bartenders tend to use a 2-to-1 simple syrup. I think that's not practical for the home because it's too viscous. It doesn't measure well. But it keeps longer and it's more efficient when you're in a bartender situation, when you're in a bar. So there's all kinds of little things like that you learn.
Uh, Last thing for me, something you can try that I read and I find works quite well. I drop a little bit of lactic acid in my simple syrups. And this was something that a couple bartenders kind of wrote about, that they feel like that created more of that creamy mouthfeel in a 1-to-1 simple syrup, just to kind of add a little bit more tang and a little bit more viscosity to it. So
lactic acid, not ascorbic acid.
Yep. So I do lactic acid. Yeah.
What form is the lactic acid come in?
Good question. You can buy powdered. I happen to have a liquid. And so I'll just add, if I'm making a decent size, 3/4 of a cup sugar and water, simple syrup, I'll do a little eighth or quarter of a teaspoon, probably around an eighth of a teaspoon in there. And I can just taste the difference in there. So I have go ahead.
That's new to me, and I find that really interesting. And I want to know how it affects the drink compared to, say, a daiquiri made with your simple syrup versus traditional simple syrup.
Mm-hmm. I will. Sorry to everybody listening at home, but I'll send this to you right now, Michael. Here's a article from Punch, and I'll link out to it in the show notes. How about that? Here's a Punch article that's got talks about lactic acid right there. So,
okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Again, that's new to me. In this world, in the culinary world, you're always learning, always learning. And that's what makes it so fun and interesting.
So this should be coming out right around the time of the book comes out, but I'm sure
so.
That's right. I'm sure it's available everywhere. But tell us your website. Where should people be following you and your work?
The book is called The Book of Cocktail Ratios: The Surprising Simplicity of Our Classic Cocktails. You can get it wherever books are sold, Amazon, indie bookstores. My site is ruhlman.com, ruhlman.com. I have a Substack newsletter, and I usually have a cocktail on that newsletter. It's just Ruhlman at ruhlman.substack.com. It's free. I enjoy doing it. I enjoy hearing from people. So those are places to reach me, find out more about my books and my work, and to contact me. In this age, in this unusual age that we live in, I've really enjoyed connecting with people such as yourself and connecting with readers. Only connect, as E.M. Forster commanded.
Thanks for this, Michael. It's been a lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Been fun for me too. Thanks so much.
You're very welcome. Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening. The show notes for today's episode are available at decodingcocktails.com/podcast. If you'd like to keep up with what we're working on, there are two great ways to do so. One, our short weekly newsletter, Cocktail Confidential, which you can sign up for at decodingcocktails.com/newsletter. Or give us a follow on Instagram at Decoding Cocktails. If you think this podcast is great stuff, we'd love it if you'd subscribe or, of course, share an episode with a friend. The Decoding Cocktails podcast is produced by Chris Bay and myself. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again soon, and happy cocktailing.